there, welcome aboard for today's Tech Tuesdays webinar on IICS Continuous Integration or Deployment. I'm Rinda, who will be hosting today's webinar. The presenter for the session is Sriram Sheshadri and Shiv Patel, Informatica veterans from the Customer Success Technologies team handling cloud data warehouse and data lake journey, and has developed a niche in cloud data management solutions. Before we start this webinar, let's go through some housekeeping tips. The webinar is for 1 hour, including the 50 minutes Q&A. You can post your queries in the Q&A box. Dial-in participants are muted for the session. The session is being recorded and will be available in the Informatica Support YouTube channel and the Success portal. You will also be able to download the slide deck from the Success portal. Please feel free to put in your feedbacks and suggestions for the session in the post-webinar survey. The Tech Tuesdays webinars are hosted within the Success portal, which is a microlearning platform that offers free and unlimited learning to all registered users. This feature-rich platform was launched to help you learn and use Informatica products better. A newly launched learning path on IICS Primer for Power Center developers has been curated to address all your Power Center to IICS requirements. Here are a few important links that you can go over later that will help you in your product adoption journey with Informatica. Over to you, Sriram and Shiv. Thank you.
Thank you, Vinda. Let's jump right into it. So today's agenda would be the 4 main sections: target personas, GitHub native integration with IICS, CI/CD using REST API and CLI, and we are going to cover demo in each sections. So let's move to next slide. Target persona. So today, I mean, this is mostly the migration activity, right? So migration activities, most of the organization is in migration activity is managed by either DevOps team or production support team, or you have developer team who does these migrations. So these are the main personas. And again, in the DevOps team, they are centralized team for any organization, and they take care of end-to-end CI/CD activities, which migrates from one environment to another, and which basically they tracks the changes for every team, what's going on, what are the changes, what is the release, what version it's going, and they maintain the environment, right? So that's what it talks about, and that's the one of the target persona. And second is the developer who does the migration, and they try to have automated ways to export import kind of activity, and maintain version control. So sometimes if a developer wants to roll back to different version, they would be able to do it, right? So these are the 2 main target persona. And then the crux of the work is moving assets from one environment to another, right? And then maintain the version control, right? So if you're maintaining, if not, then it's just moving asset from one version to one environment to another. So Sriram, over to you now. Yeah.
Hi all, thanks a lot for joining this webinar. This is Sriram here from Informatica. We're going to start with talking about the Git native integration that's available as part of the IICS platform. Let's jump onto it. So there are these different Git flavors that you might be using, which could be GitHub, GitLab, Bitbucket, or Azure DevOps, and so on. Or you could just use a standalone Git repository, which is just a hosted Git repository in your own data center. So from a SaaS perspective, if you have your repository hosted in the GitHub SaaS offering or Azure DevOps, you will have out of the box integration, Git integration in IICS. You can also bring in your self-hosted on-prem Git repositories. Again, it could be of any Git flavor. It could be GitLab, Bitbucket, or GitHub. And we also support the generic Git repo if required. There are some limitations of using the Git generic repo, which we'll cover shortly. Just a quick note on using the on-prem Git repo. You need something called as a Git Connect Agent app to connect your on-prem Git repo. it's something that you can just enable it in your org, and this would pretty much work with any on-prem Git repository. Now, with respect to the Git generic repo that I was mentioning in the previous slide, you can still connect IICS to your generic Git repo. It's just that it's not certified and tested from Informatica side. On the other hand, we have certified GitHub, GitLab, Bitbucket from IICS. So that's something that's certified. So if you have to reach out to support, or if you have to raise a feature request, we can do it for all the Git flavors on the on-prem Git repository, apart from the generic Git repo. Just a point to note that. All right, let's jump on to the the organization of having your dev, QA, and prod orgs assigned to your Git repository. Pretty much this is a standard recommendation that we kind of emphasize on maintaining specific orgs for dev, QA, and prod. And with the latest release, you also have the capability of assigning branches to each of your orgs, right? So you could actually connect your dev org to a dev branch in Git, and you can do the same thing for test and prod. So in that way, you would maintain separate branches for each of these orgs and kind of maintain isolation. All right, let's see what are the different things that you need to set up for having a seamless version control in your IICS platform. So the first thing, as we mentioned in the previous slide, is obviously maintaining different dev, test, and prod orgs. This should ensure that your environments are isolated. You don't have any unreviewed code checked into prod. You have everything going through a seamless pipeline. If reviewed, if there is a review process, you could also enable that as part of your CI/CD pipeline. And then have all your verified and tested code get into prod finally. And you can also start to configure your dev orgs, your primary development orgs, to have read-write access into your Git repository, and your test or prod, which are basically called your non-development orgs, have just read access. Again, this would enable any kind of, this would basically avoid any write access on your production orgs or your test org, so that no one just logs into the org and creates inconsistent assets across your non-dev orgs. All right. The other thing that we want to point out is you would typically want your dev orgs to be connected to a single Git repository. If you have multiple dev orgs, and if they're all pointing to the same GitHub repository, for example, you're going to have a lot of inconsistency, overwrites, and so on. So you might want to kind of handle such scenarios by using a different repository if need be, or you could possibly even use a different branch altogether if you're using multiple dev orgs. But if it's just a typical standard SDLC template where you just have one dev, one QA, and then one prod, they can all still be connected to the same repository, but just be configured with different branches if need be, right? So this is the initial setup. The other setup that you would do is at an administrator level, you would obviously configure the GitHub repository. We would shortly see that in the demo soon. And at an individual user level, you would want to set up your GitHub credentials, for example, where you could get your personal access token from GitHub and configure that as your profile settings. That way, you clearly have tracking and auditing as to who checks in the code, who has made these changes, and so on. So these are the two steps of configuration that you need to do before you enable version control in your IICS org. So again, to quickly summarize, you would first configure the admin level repository settings, and the second would be at an individual user level. Every user would log in and add their personal access token for audit and tracking for their Git commits. So that will be the initial setup. Let's move on to the development phase. So now, how would your typical day look when you're using version control in IICS, right? So you would, I think all of you would have been familiar with the project folder structures in IICS. So you could typically create golden copies of your repositories, which would just mimic the same way in your Git repository, for example, and then have your developers maintain their own projects if need be. So developers would create those assets, test them, and then place them into the golden project folder, which would eventually get checked in, right? And they could do this on a day in, day out basis. And typically you would use this structure so that the developer clearly knows that whatever he's placing in the golden project is something that they expect to reach to prod after verification or review if required. Before you kind of pull these assets into your target org, that is one prereq when you're using the out-of-the-box Git integration. The prereq is you would have to create the connections and the runtime environments before you do a Git pull. Again, there are some ways to automate this with respect to both creating the agent, registering the agent, and creating and migrating those connections from your development arc. But those has to be orchestrated along with your CI/CD pipeline before you do the Git pull. So that's like a prerequisite that you'll have to follow. And again, this could be one time, or obviously this could also be a continuous process, because you would be creating new connections all the time with respect to creating new assets, right? So you would have to be mindful of the fact that the connections that you create in your dev org, there has to be some orchestration on getting those connections also set up in your production org. The other rule of thumb with respect to using Git is every time you check out for any update, it is always recommended that you do this along with all the dependencies that come with the specific asset. For example, you can, if you're changing something in the mapping task, it's recommended that you also check out the mapping that comes along with it, because there might be some changes that you would want to do at the mapping level and then also in the mapping task, and then check in both of these assets together. Now, if you're doing something just in the mapping task, which does not have any consequences in the underlying mapping, you could technically also check in the mapping task separately. But the first time that you're checking in any kind of assets, it's always recommended that you check in all the dependencies in one shot. So for example, if you're going to check in, you're creating a net new mapping and a mapping task, and you check in just a mapping task for the first time, and then you also do a Git pull in your QA org, for example, you're going to get an import error or a Git pull error because you wouldn't have the dependent mapping already present in that org. So be mindful of the fact that every time you're pushing any asset, the dependencies are already present in the upstream orgs. If they don't have any changes on the dependent asset. But if you're making any changes across all your dependencies, it's recommended that you all check in a single hash. And there are different ways to find out these dependencies in the IICS UI. So you can obviously use them to filter out and then check in all of them together in one single shot. Yeah, so I think, for example, you can also think of scenarios where you have a mapping and you're using a REST connector, for example, and the REST connector depends on a business service if you're using it midstream. So you will have to, it's better that you kind of check in all of these together. And if you miss out the business service, for example, you would get an import or a Git pull error in your target org. So that's typically how your development would look. So quickly to summarize again, you would have a golden copy of your project repository that you want to kind of mimic or push into your Git repo. And then developers can basically place the assets on how we have structured. So we have seen customers structuring the root project folder across business verticals, for example. Some of them have organized it to be split across different asset types like mapping separately or task flow separately and so on. So so based on how we have organized, the developer places the asset in that specific folder and then goes through the check-in process. Right. So next thing I want to go over is a sample workflow. It's kind of extending to the conversation that we had so far with the developing phase. So this would be a sample workflow if you want to bring in the review process in between, right? So a lot of customers have the review where there's a lead or an architect who comes in and reviews the code that you have developed, and then only checked and verified code kind of gets into the QA and the production arc. So if you were to implement such a process in your existing IICS org, how would you kind of combine the Git integration with with the workflow that you have in place already, right? So you can follow the same the golden project principle that we just discussed. The developer basically checks in the code, places it in the appropriate folder, and then checks in the code, and then the code that the asset that they check in goes through a pull request to the reviewer. Once the reviewer sees the pull request, they then log into the dev org and verify the code there, make sure everything is following the best practices, the code is efficient, and so on, and then finally approve the pull request in Git. So this is not like a traditional programming language where you could just verify the code in the pull request itself. There is a hop here where you'll have to go to the IICS org, the developer org, and verify the code in the folder that it was placed in. And then once you've reviewed the mapping, for example, you'd go back to the Git UI. It could be any Git client that you're using, it could be desktop or on the web, and then approve the pull request. So, and most of these CI/CD tools have plugins to listen onto these approval notifications. So you can have something like Jenkins looking for that approval notice in the pull request, and then you can kind of initiate a cherry pick of that specific commit into the QA branch. So a developer checks in the code into a dev branch. The reviewer comes in. The reviewer approves the code. Once that approval is done, Jenkins picks up the approval notification and then does a cherry pick of that commit into the QA branch. Now, then you would have your Git pull APIs, pick in that code and then push it into the appropriate QA orgs, for example, using the Git pull API. This is to kind of achieve complete automation behind the scenes. You could also use the Git pull button that's available in the UI to pull in this code from the QA branch into your QA org. And you would kind of repeat the same process for your production, right? Just that there is no review from QA to production, but the cherry picking process can still be extended from the QA org into the production org in a seamless fashion. So everything is controlled by a CI/CD pipeline behind the scenes. So all the developer needs to do is just check in the code and raise a pull request, and then the reviewer can take it from that. So this is a sample workflow that you could try out in your org if you have a review process in place. If you don't have a review process in place, it's pretty much the same thing, except that there's no pull request or an approval notification in between. It's just directly cherry picked into your QA org and your production org. So your CI/CD tool will take care of that. All right, let's jump on to the demo where I kind of walk you through the different configurations, how you could check in, check out code from the UI, how you can do the pull from your QA org, for example, and so on. All right, let's get started with the demo. So I assume you can see my Chrome browser. So the first setting that you'll have to do to enable Git in your org is first see if you have the source control license enabled. So this is a custom license that you'll have to get enabled in case you don't already have this in your org. So once source control is enabled, you can start to configure the repository, and you can also start using your IICS platform for any Git operations, right? So the next step would be to configure the Git repository for the specific org. This repository would apply to all the services that support Git versioning. And you can also give in the master name that you want to tie to this org. As we went through in our presentation, you can configure this to either dev, QA, or a master branch based on what this org type is. So this is like the first basic step. This is that's configured for across the org, right? So the next setting that you'll have to do is for your personal setting. You'll have to configure your personal access token and your Git credentials, and IICS would basically use this to add your name when it does a commit, right? So that you would go back to the data integration service, and this is not at an admin level. This is at individual user level. Once the user logs in, they can choose any service, and then click on the user tab here, user button, and then click on settings. So once you click on settings, you'll basically come to this page You can give your Git username and your personal access token that you want to give assigned for IICS. So once this is done, you're all set with respect to the prerequisites for starting to use Git. And then you will also see the source control tab, source control column, sorry, in your Explore tab, right? This is when you know that you're ready to use Git, and then you can start using all the Git operations from within the IICS UI. So the next step is let's go ahead and try to check in. So I created a new project of sorts here, and then there's an asset that you can see here which I just created. Now let's try to check in this asset and push it into the Git repository. I'm going to come back to the folder here, and I'm going to just click on check-in. And then you can see both the mapping and the root project folder name coming up as part of the assets to choose. And then you'll just go click on check-in here. Then you can give in a comment. Once this is done, you're all set for the first check-in into your Git repository. You also have the source control logs where you can go and monitor what's the status of the check-in, and this also applies for checkout. So what this means is once the check-in is done, you would see a check-in icon, a green icon here in this column. So the check-in is done, and you can see a green icon saying that it's checked in, right? Now let's look at the other options that are available as part of this folder, right? So anytime a developer or anyone who's using the platform needs to make a change, they would first need to check out, and they can obviously do this at a root project level, or they can go inside the mapping and start doing this at an individual asset level also, right? So anyone who wants to make any modifications, they first do a checkout, make those changes, and then come back and check in again. Now, if you want to pull or roll back to a previous version, you can use this git pull. You can use this pull functionality. It would basically give you a list of hash. So let's just go ahead and click on that. So this was the first check-in that we did. So this gives you the hash, and then you can basically roll back to that specific hash if required, right? So that's what the pull would do. And then, so let's first check out this. So once this is checked out, you can see the icon changes and it says check.myme. So if another user logs into the same org, it'll basically tell you checked out, and then it'll have my first name, last name, so that others would know that someone is working on this asset, and then they would basically not be able to do any modifications on that. So once you've made some changes, you go to the mapping, you can basically make whatever changes you want. And once you've made this change, you can come back to the asset here and then check in again. So this is exactly the same process that we went through some time back. And then there's a new version of this mapping that's created, right? Now let's kind of do an undo checkout and then also show you something where when it's in the checked in state, you can see that you don't see the design part. It's in a read-only mode. So this is what would happen if someone else logins to the org, and if they want to do a check, if they want to do a change, they would actually see this if someone else has checked out, right? So it's going to be read-only for them. So that's one of the other options that you have under this actions here, and in case you don't want this asset to be tracked as part of your repository, you can unlink it. So so any changes that you make wouldn't go back to the repository, and that's something that you can kind of stop tracking this as part of the Git repository. So that's when you start using the unlink option, right? So this is all. These are the different options that are available in your developer org, for example, right? So once the check-in is done, you're all set. This code is right now in the repository. So let's go ahead and try to pull this in another org and then see what are the assets that are coming in, right? So let me go to the other org real quick. So let's go ahead and do a git pull from this org here. So once I click on this button, you would see all the different projects that I've stored in my repository. I'm just going to choose the one that we just checked in from the older org. And then I'm going to choose the hash that I want to choose for the specific project. And I'm going to click on next, and I can choose all the different assets that we checked into this project folder, right? And I'm going to do a pull. So once I've done a pull, I should be able to see all the new assets that we just created. So I'm just going to refresh this page here. All right, so you see the Git demo that we just checked in, and you can also see the new mapping that we just created and checked in here, right? So this is the Git pull flow from the UI by using this button right here. And you can see all the assets that come along with the specific project. And you can also choose a specific hash if you want to roll back, or if you want to choose, if you want to bring in a previous version of the same asset, right? And we also have a Git pull API that you can use if you want to orchestrate all of this using the CI/CD pipeline, right? So it's pretty straightforward. You would, and even in this org, again, if you had configured with a different branch, then you can actually configure just read access. So then no one just logs into this org and then makes changes here and checks it in, right? So that would just make it inconsistent. Overwriting what was already created and verified from your dev option. So that's all I have to show with respect to the Git demo. We can probably answer any questions if you have towards the end of the webinar. Thanks a lot again.
Hello everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. Let me share my screen. So today we are going to talk about the SDLC process for the Informatica Cloud and continuous integration and continuous development as well. And in Informatica Cloud, how are you going to achieve it? Right? So using the REST API and command line utility, and this is the topic I'm going to cover today. Okay, so moving to the first slide. So the way you do the object export import, right? How would we do it automatically using the REST API command line utility in this case, right? So let's say developers are doing the deployment. Sorry, developers are doing the development, in Informatica Cloud, like designing the assets or the ETL mapping, different task flows, mapping tasks, using the runtime objects, and all those different aspects of development that you are doing in Informatica Cloud. So once your development is complete, right, your testing is completed, you get the sign off. Now you need to move into higher environment, right? So in this case, high environment, we are talking about dev org and then production org. So you need to migrate the code from development to production org, right? Now, for the export and import point of view, you will have you may be having either DevOps team or developers who are doing that. Now, you would export the list of assets that needs to get deployed, right, in a high environment. So you export it, and then based on your external version control, you use Git or Subversion or anything, right, Bitbucket or anything. So you do this check in, check out, and all those process of version control managing. Once you do that, and then you want to import into the higher environment, right? So you would check out from here and then import those list of assets in production org, right? So this is the end-to-end process flow from the DevOps point of view, and then and you would like to achieve this using an automated manner. And sometimes customers have Jenkins or any DevOps tools that needs to get orchestrated. Right? So yeah, moving to the next slide. The first step is we're going to talk about command line interface, using the command line interface utility. Right? So here we are showing 3 environment: dev, test, and production environment. Now, let's say you have the project and project main folder 1 and folder 2, and you have different assets. So you need to extract this, right? So extract this in the sense whatever the let's say if it's incremental release, you will have the list of assets that needs to get migrated, or if it's initial release, then you would want to the complete the folder 1 and folder 2 export and move into the environment. Right? Now, in order to give the list of assets, either you can ask a developer to provide you in the file, where you can have the list of assets that needs to get migrated, or you can have using tag, right? So Informatica Cloud provides the tag, and the tag you can define for release, right? So maybe release July or release June, for example. Right? So that kind of tag you can maintain. So extract, so if you use tag, then you have different commands that will generate the file and you use that for extract. Or if you are maintaining the file, then you can directly use it for extraction. So that's the step 1 where you do the extract, and extract command line is there, and we'll go through the demo process, right? So I'll show you how it looks like. So you extract the code, you put it in Git, and after that you check out and package it, and then deploy it to higher environment. Yeah, so the test, and then once testing is completed, you use the same code, or if any modification is there, then you go through the same process again. You modify in dev, you check it in Git, and then move it into same thing, right? Git and test. So use that same version of the code whichever is being used in test environment, you move into production environment, right? So that's how your end-to-end process of command line looks like, right? So here we just talked about the command lines that you're going to use, right? So like the way I was talking about the list, right? So if you have the tag, right, then you have the list command that will generate the file. So and export command will use the list command has generated the file. So use the same file, and then you use that for exporting. And this is just exporting is being done in zip file. You extract it, you check in the assets in version control, and then check out upload from Git repository or any version control you have. Package that checkout assets using the package command and the same file that you have over here, right? So or you can generate the file like I said. So package it, and then you have the import command to importing into the higher environment of Informatica Cloud. Once import is done, then you would have to go and publish these assets manually, and especially so publish is optional, right? If it's needed, not every asset needs to get published. So let's say in task flow point of view, if you're using run a job CLI, then you may need to do publishing. For CI, and you have to publish all these process, connections and guides, everything. So that's about the publishing portion of it, right? So moving to the next slide. This is just it talks about how easy to integrate with Jenkins, right? So it's just this is kind of command that you would see in IICS for CLI. And this is just a Jenkins snippets. Now we are going to talk about the second option of export input using the REST API. Right? So, so in the REST API point of view, right? So this is the REST calls that we are going to make to Informatica Cloud, right? So, you have the list of, let's say you use tag. Now in the command line you generate the file, right? So similarly here you need to use the objects API to generate the to get the list of objects and their metadata. And this metadata, one of them is GUID, GUID, and that ID needs to be used for exporting. So step 2 would be you have the export API, which uses the IDs for these tasks, and we export it, right? So you go to get those IDs for exporting, and merge it in all the club it in the export calls and then pass those IDs, right? So you get the job ID, and then so in Informatica Cloud, you may be noticing when you export the assets, right? Then it gets into the export input area of it, then you have to go and download the file, right? So similarly in APIs, in the step 3, you have to go and download that zip file, right? So the command is called package. So the API is called package using the existing using the step 2 job ID. You use that, package it, and then download it. So this is the file that exported file you got and get with the package zip file, right? Now, in between, you can have a version control process, which we have not depicted in this diagram. So you will have Git, let's say Git or external version control check and check out process. So once and the testing and all those things is done, then you move into input process of API, right? So on the import side of it, you have the import API, and then same way, right? You refer to the package API, package API for import, and then you provide the package file name. So package file name, and then you get the import upload status. So you upload the zip file first, and then you'll have the actual import, right? So that package is just doing the upload in the Informatica Cloud. So you get the import job ID, and then you do the actual import using the 4 job ID. So that's your end-to-end REST calls and REST. I think there's 5 main calls. So before issuing the objects, you will have one login API. That's a standard to get the token and then pass those tokens for all the 5 steps, right? So that's the way to call the REST call, right? So moving to a demo session of it. So I'll show you how to make a REST call or CLI calls. Okay, so let's start the demo for REST API. Let me share my screen. Yeah, so we'll get into the Zoom. Yeah, sorry. Let's get into the login API. So as part of the REST API, we'll call the login API to get the IC session ID, and then we'll get into the objects. So we go into login API, get the this is just the user name just for demo purpose. So login API is pretty straightforward. Content type we just provide JSON, and then body is username and password. You go and send it, and then you get the response as the IC session ID and other details of the user. So step 1 would be we are going to use the object API. So step 1 is object API, where I'm doing the query filter as a R1 June, which is released for the June. So if you go in Informatica Cloud, these are the 4 assets. I tagged it for release 1 June. Now, so this is just session ID and body is nothing. So you go and submit it, and you get all the list of asset IDs and their metadata. So you use this ID for the export, right? So when you go to export, I just open the export API. You see this export API, and then in the body, we just provide all these IDs for those assets. So in this case, I've just taken three asset IDs, which is and I given the different options. So in this particular asset ID, I'm saying dependency include the true. So I want to export with the dependency. For this one, I don't want to import the dependency. And this is I didn't pass on any message and it include dependency parameters. So it default is true. So it will bring the dependent object as part of the export, right? So you do that export and then you get the export ID, like this ID. And then next step is, after export, you go and check the export status, and same thing in first session ID you provide. And here, right? So in the export ID, you just provide those export job ID. So in that we just talked about the export job ID. That's what the API link is going to be, URL link is going to be. So you go and send and you get the so here you go here, export it, you get the ID, and it says status is in progress. You go to this and you go and get the export status, right? So what is export status? Export completed successfully, right? And you can go and so here we get the export ID and we got it. So we go and try to download the package. Okay, so now this one is downloading the package. Right, so this just talks about the export status. Now, yeah, so just to show you, right? You go here and you see the export, status export completed successfully, right? That's what it says. Now, similarly, right? So we go to the import. Yeah, so sorry. Well, after export status, my API URL was same for export package. So you have the export and ID, export ID, and then package. So when you send it, the response you get the zip file, and this is where you save that to file. Right, so I saved it into the file, which is response.zip file. If you go and see this response.zip file, you get all this content of the export the way you see it in the UI, right? So you export it, and similarly, you go and import. I'll get the session ID for import. You go and import it, provide the session ID, and here what we are saying is you have multi-form data, and as part of body you upload that zip file, right? So when you go ahead and send that, so this it will start the import import. So it will basically upload your file zip file, and when you want to start the import, you just go and provide the import ID, and that's where import in progress. Now, if you want to go and see the import status, you go and provide the get call for particular import ID, right? So you can just see the status, and it says import completed successfully. So that's the REST API process for importing, exporting, and importing, right? So, if you have any question, you can let us know. But yeah, this is about it for the REST API demo. Okay, so let's get started for the REST API command line utility demo, and I'm sharing my screen now. So here, right in the back, we have seen the commands that needs to get executed, just like REST API we did, right? So let's export, extract. So this is pretty straightforward. Right now, uh, so if you run the commands, so this is the utility, IICS exe utility we have that you can download. It's in as part of KV that we will share. So with that, you right now username and password is hard coded, and we have a feature to put this in a file and then take it as input. So that's the username and password right now is hard coded, and that's how it is for now. So this list tag, right? Again, the list is command, and the query filter is tag R1 July and output file. So when you run this command, it gives you the file, and when you see this file, R1 July, I did. So this is the R1 July text file, which was typed for R1 July. These are the artifacts, right? So after getting the file using list, what we do is export, right? So we have the export command. So yeah, so here, right? So this is the export command that you see. Export region, for the host name, username, password, file path, and log label, and the artifacts file that I was talking about, right? So here is the artifacts file that we have generated in the step one, right? So when you do enter, so it will export it, right? And export is in progress. This will get stored into zip file. So this that it get completed. So just meanwhile showcase. So this is the list of commands that I'm using. List, export, extract, package, and import, right? So extract is going to happen in the zip file. So export is completed, and then it downloaded the file in this path. Now, once you download, now you want to unzip it, right? So for unzipping, we have the extract. Right now, this download, this export is with all the dependent objects. So in the CLI, we don't have option of, dependency flag like API that we have. So it will download all the dependent objects as well. So next step is we do extract. So we just extract this path, and this is a zip file. We extract it, got extracted. So once extract is done, you need to, again, I mean, in between you will have Git commands or version controls to check in. Now, let's say before importing, we need to package it, right? So package it again using this file which was generated on the list command. So you use that same thing. You package it, right? So all this is being done. You can see it. So right now we just package it. 7 July import. So this is package. Now last step would be import it, right? So once packaging is done, then you import it. So yeah, that's about it, right? So this import is completed. Now, if you want to see the Informatica Cloud, share Informatica Cloud. So you go here, and you can see the import export log. So it's just this user is different. Let's see. Okay, import is also completed, so it's all done, right? So you can see this all this import and export status over here, and that's about it from the demo point of view. Now, so as a summary, right? So these are the documentation that we talked about. So this is GitHub integration, IICS with GitHub documentation, IICS with GitHub integration, asset management CLI documentation, Jenkins, and other things, right? So these are the documentation list. You can look into it and explore. And if you have any question, please reach out to CSM or your account manager, and then we'll be able to help you out. Thank you.
Everyone, please post your queries in the Q&A box. We'll try and answer them. Over to you, Sriram or Shiv. Can we read out the questions in the Q&A box?
Hey, thanks, Linda. I'm just checking if there are any new questions. Yeah, if you have any new questions, please post on the chat window, and then we will be happy to answer them. There's one question which says, how do we pull from another org or different branch? I think as we saw in the demo, right, once you go to the org repo settings, you can just point to the same repository and then point to the branch that you want to pull from. And then branch to branch orchestration, you can do it using a CI/CD pipeline. As I mentioned, you can also do cherry picking between those branches and then get the commit to a different branch, and then you can pull from that branch in your QA or UAT org, right? So you, in the admin settings, you have a way to mention the branch that you want to pull from. So for every org, the branch can be different. So there's another question, can we publish CAI assets with CI/CD? So you can publish using the IICS utility that Shiv just mentioned. Through the API, we are planning for a GA API that will be available soon. But if you still want to go ahead and need the API for your orchestration or to go live immediately, please reach out to your CSM. There are some other ways to do that through the API. But if you want to use the IICS utility, it's already available. You have a publish command which you could use for publishing your assets.
Yeah, there's one question. I mean, one request for the demo for the modifying QA. Unfortunately, we cannot demo it right now. I think we have just 7 minutes, and we would like to get to all the questions answered. If you still want to, see the demo or have any questions, then please reach out to your respective customer success manager, and we'll get in touch with you.
There's another question that says, how can we get the ID in REST API? So there are some lookup APIs that you could use, and with the lookup APIs, and there are some object APIs also which you could use, get the ID, and then you can use those IDs for consecutive API calls. But yeah, the APIs are available on the platform. Yeah, the other question is, can we not have IICS repo pointing to multiple branches for multiple developers? No, we can't do that. It's still pointing to one repo and one branch. There's no concept of creating your own feature branch and then doing a full request that we would do in a traditional programming language setup. Here, you still have to follow a one branch policy and then use the pull request or other ways to kind of orchestrate it.
So just to add on to it, this multiple branch code merging, this concept is mostly for the programming language or text-based development. But here, all the development is through IICS console. So you cannot really merge two code, right? So that's the reason we have restricted to one branch. And then any changes you need to make, then you need to have exclusive log and make changes accordingly.
Thank you, Sriram and Shiv. As we wait, I would want to call out that this recording will be available in the Informatica Support YouTube channel and the Success Portal. There in Success Portal, you will also be able to download the slide deck. Also, we have a feedback survey at the end of the session. Please let us know your thoughts about the session or upcoming topics if you have any. There you go. There is another question, Shiv.
Sorry, so I was just repeating the existing question which was answered. One of attendee asked the question about these features are not July release features. All these features are already available, and this webinar is just to give you the options and enable all the customers for different CI/CD options that we have.
So there's a new question. Are there any examples of where a user checks in code which can automatically raise a pull request in GitHub, indicating a peer review is necessary, right? You can configure this outside of IICS. This is not within the scope of IICS, right? So this is something that you have to orchestrate behind the scenes. I think that's possible using the GitHub configurations or any other Git repo configurations, right? But yeah, the short answer is you'll have to kind of manage this outside of IICS, not within IICS. The other question is, once the pull request is approved, could that trigger a Jenkins pipeline to push the commit to the next higher node? Yes. So again, this is similar to the previous question. We can't do that within IICS, but Jenkins and most of the other tools have these plugins or out-of-the-box feature where it can read the approved request and automatically do a cherry pick of that commit to another branch, right? And then you would use that branch for your higher environments. So yeah, so you just have to work with your CI/CD tool, use the plugin or whatever the feature that's available, and then listen into the approval notification from Git. So that will be a way to orchestrate that. But yeah, this is because, so all of this is outside the scope of IICS primarily for the reason because we don't control what CI/CD pipeline you use, or you're using just a bunch of scripts behind the scenes, right? So you want to concentrate on a platform to give you the ability to check in code and maintain versions and so on. But all the orchestrations and other stuff that you want to do with Git is something that you can handle within your scope of your CI/CD tool. Another question says, do we need additional master plan organizations created for each environment, or can sub-orgs be used? So there are two ways that you could create multiple organizations, right? So one is the traditional dev sandbox or the sandbox production model, and the other one is the sub-org model, right? Now this could vary based on what how do you want to isolate your orgs. Like for example, some customers would want to split their orgs and maintain autonomy based on region or business unit, for example, and those customers would go for the sub-org option. And there are customers who will just centrally maintain as an IT team or a central data integration platform team, and they would go with the sandbox production model, right? So there are both these options available based on your requirements, and you can obviously connect to Git for any of these orgs, so it doesn't matter what the org type is. Not sure if that answers your question. If you can give in more detail, if you're looking for something specific, we can answer that too.
There is another question.
There's another question.
Yes, go ahead, Sriram.
Yeah, go ahead.
No,
yeah, I think Shiv, have you already answered that in the chat? I see that it's been answered. But
not yet. I was just typing in.
Okay. So how do you control the order of deployment mapping first and then task and task flow? So when you commit it as one hash, the order does not matter as long as the dependencies and references are there. The import would succeed. But in case you import a task flow without a dependent mapping task, for example, then the import would fail. So there's no specific order as such. As long as the dependencies are within the same hash, you should be good to go.
So there's a question about tagging. I mean, it's up to really, up to you. I mean, I would recommend to use as a month. If let's say if you do the weekly release or monthly release, then tag it with the name and year if possible, right? So in that way, whenever you go back and see the tag, then you know this tag is a reference to which release. Because V1, V2 will not give you the additional information.
There's another question. It says, how does the Git pull automatically publish the task flow? No, it does not. So as I mentioned, you can use the IICS command line option, which has the publish command to publish the task. If you're looking for an orchestrated API, please reach out to us to your CSM or the support channel. We should be able to give you an API. It's just that it has to go through an approval. It's not GA yet, the publish API, which can be publicly used. So we need to go through a process and see if it's applicable for you and then get it enabled. But if that's not something that you could use, you have the IICS command out of the box already. So you have to use a hybrid approach where you probably use the API for the Git pull and then use the IICS command and publish option to publish all those tasks. So that's something that you can use right away. But if you're looking for an API, please reach out to us and then we'll see what we can do for you.
Thank you, Sriram and Shiv. I think we have answered most of the questions that came in. If ever we are able to answer any of your questions, we'll get back to you after the session. Thank you, Sriram and Shiv, for the wonderful session. And thank you for your valuable time for this. Also, thanks everyone for joining. Unfortunately, we have crossed the time limit of the session. Thanks everyone for joining. See you on our next Tech Tuesdays. Bye.
Thanks all and goodbye. Have a good one. Bye.